What's up, everybody, and welcome back to another video from the 10-7 MMA show. And today I'm making a video that I've been wanting to make for a super long time, and this is about the Jon Jones conspiracy. This has to do with everything that's been going on between Jon Jones, Dana White, and Stipe Miocic, obviously, but also some people that haven't been mentioned, but I think are heavily involved in why, number one, Dana White is pushing so hard to continuously call Jon Jones the pound-for-pound greatest fighter of all time, the GOAT, et cetera, et cetera. And also why he is pushing so much for this fight against Stipe, but moreover, not just a fight against Stipe, but a fight against Stipe for the heavyweight title. So without further ado, let's jump in. So before we get into the meat of the conspiracy and why I think this fight is continuously being pushed, I want to go into the history of Jon Jones versus Stipe, how this match came about, when it came about. And the reason why we want to do this is because I feel as though Jon Jones is getting a tremendous amount of hate for quote-unquote ducking Tom Aspinall and all these other things, which I think is ridiculous. This is not his fault. This fight was made a long time ago, and I'm going to just refresh your memory with the timeline so you can see where I'm coming from. So first of all, as we remember, back in March 4th of 2023, this is when Jon Jones beat Ciryl Gane for the heavyweight title, and he won in incredible fashion. Okay, then after this, Jones immediately calls out Stipe Miocic. Dana White loves it. They want to do it because Stipe Miocic is considered to be the greatest heavyweight of all time, so why not? Fitting for a legacy fight for Jon Jones. Okay, so this is in 2023. At this point, Tom Aspinall's last fight was a loss to Curtis Blaydes on July 23rd, 2022, and this is due to injury. So he wasn't even in the title picture at this time. He had a severe knee injury during a fight. It was a TKO loss, but not really a loss to Curtis Blaydes. But anyways, that happened almost a year before this. And moreover, Tom Aspinall's next fight happened shortly after Jones beat Gane on July 22nd, right, one day before, but just a year after, one day before he lost to Curtis Blaydes against Marcin Tybura, and he won that fight. Now, at this time, nobody, to my recollection, was really complaining about this fight set up between Jon Jones and Stipe, and this fight was set for November of 2023. So everything was looking good. People were very excited, and then right before the fight happened, Jon Jones had to pull out due to an injury. He had a torn pectoral muscle, I believe. Aspinall is called in as a replacement, but he doesn't fight Stipe. Instead, he fights Sergey Pavlovich, who was an up-and-comer. He was just starching people in the UFC, so he was a big contender. So they had the fight of Aspinall versus Pavlovich, and that was for the interim heavyweight title. So they threw that fight together, I think, in 2 weeks' notice, and Aspinall won. Now, I don't remember exactly when the Jones-Stipe fight was rescheduled because I think they had to assess the injury and all these things, but it was eventually pushed back to November of this year, November of 2024. Then, as we saw recently at UFC 304 back in July of 2024, Aspinall then defended the interim title against Curtis Blaydes successfully, very successfully. Now I want to get to this next slide of why we should stop blaming Jon Jones. He's been getting so much hate. People are saying he's ducking Tom Aspinall, so I want to talk about why I think this is nonsense. First and foremost, it's the UFC that makes the fights, not Jon Jones. He's not supposed to jump in and say, wait a minute, I don't want this fight, even though you rescheduled it, you're asking for it, you're allowing me to retain the title. No, I should relinquish my title or I should ask for another fight. That's not how it works. And by the way, if it was a different situation, if a fighter was asking for another fight, people would then jump on him and be like, well, you might be ducking this guy or avoiding that guy. The fights are made by the UFC. The UFC, for whatever reason, we're going to get into why I think they want this fight in a moment, but the UFC, for their own reasons, wants this fight. It's not Jon Jones's fault. Moreover, I think at this point, regardless of what you want to say about him personally and with other controversies in his life, at the end of the day, he's had an unbelievable career in the UFC, dominating the light heavyweight division and having the heavyweight title, whatever you want to say about Ciryl Gane. Ciryl Gane's a tough opponent who nearly beat Francis Ngannou. He beats him in the first round in an unbelievable fashion. I think he has earned the right to retain the title for a slightly extended period of time to make this Stipe fight happen. Now, a lot of people were saying, hey, fine, have the fight, but just have him vacate the title. It should go to Tom Aspinall, etc. First of all, the UFC didn't ask Jon Jones to vacate the title. They've done that in the past. Again, whatever the reasons are, I don't know, but they didn't do it, and so that's not Jon Jones's fault. Moreover, everybody is saying that Tom Aspinall is probably the greatest active heavyweight right now, and that very well may be true. But remember, a lot of his super impressive recent victories happened in the very recent past, right? He came back, he beat Tybura, then he beat Sergey Pavlovich, and everybody was going crazy for that. And then recently he beat Curtis Blaydes. But again, the Pavlovich fight happened in November when Jon Jones was supposed to fight Stipe, and then we just had this Curtis Blaydes fight. And yes, Aspinall's looking incredible, but that's not really a reason for them to all of a sudden cancel a fight where they have a signed bout agreement between Stipe and Jones. Now, just to give you an example, we just had Leon Edwards fight Bilal, and I think a lot of people, at least prior to the fight, were definitely thinking that Shavkat is a much more dangerous fighter than Bilal. Now, did people say that, hey, Leon's taking this Bilal fight and he's ducking Shavkat? No, nobody said that. The UFC said that he was next in line. That made sense. They scheduled it, and that was it. Now, even if it didn't make sense, it is not Leon's job to come out and say, nah, I want the toughest absolute fight possible. The UFC is making those decisions. They are doing the matchmaking, and it is what it is. So I just bring that point up to illustrate the silliness of this, that to blame Jon Jones and say that he's ducking Aspinall is just not how the business operates. Now we get into the conspiracy portion of why this is happening and why the UFC is doing this, because at least we can say we cannot blame Jon Jones. Now, the UFC, if you want to argue the meritocracy of the fight and the correct lineage of the heavyweight title and the interim title and all this stuff, okay, now we can have a little bit of a conversation. Again, I don't mind what they're doing. I don't have a problem with it, but I know a lot of people do. So let's talk about why this might be happening. So why does Dana White insist that Jones is pound for pound number one? Everybody's clowning him. He seems to bring it up over and over, as well as insist that Jones retains the title while recovering so that he can have a heavyweight title defense against Stipe and theoretically retire. I think that's what a lot of people are thinking is going to happen. Here's the answer: Francis Ngannou. So Francis, I believe, is the key to all of this, and we're going to talk about why Francis is such a threat to not only Jon Jones's potential legacy, but to the UFC in general. So if we go back to when Francis was active in the UFC after he had won against Stipe and then later on beat Cyril Gane, people were unanimously calling him the baddest man on the planet. So what is this title, the baddest man on the planet? If you are the UFC heavyweight champ, you are often called the baddest man on the planet, or can be called the baddest man on the planet, because the idea is you're in the heaviest weight class and you're the champ. So theoretically, you should be able to dominate any of the other weight classes. This may or may not be true, but let's just go roll with that assumption. You should be able to dominate anybody in the UFC, which means you are the walking embodiment of the baddest man on the planet. You are the toughest man in the world. So everybody was calling Francis this before he left the UFC, and a lot of people even after. The other thing about Francis is he technically never lost the belt. He walked away from the organization while having the heavyweight belt, and that's a very, very rare thing. A few people have walked away or retired while an active champion. Francis walked away, but moreover walked away and exited his contract. So this was unheard of. As such, if he was the baddest man on the planet while in the UFC and now he just simply left, he didn't lose or anything, maybe he still is the baddest man on the planet. And I think that's a problem in the eyes of the UFC. And again, going back to those two fighters that he beat Cyril Gane, huge, amazing fighter. Whatever people want to say, he's an incredible fighter, amazing kickboxer. Beat Stipe, again, greatest heavyweight of all time. So what does that say about Francis? And he beat Stipe at a time when Stipe was super active. He had just beat Daniel Cormier. So this was a prime Stipe, in my opinion. Now, here's the kicker, okay? He arguably beat Tyson Fury, one of the greatest, if not considered to be the greatest heavyweight boxer of all time. So this was unheard of. Nobody predicted this. And when this happened, I think most people did feel like Francis actually won that fight, which is insane. Everybody thought this was a nonsensical fight, that it was going to be a ridiculous contest and Tyson Fury was going to completely outclass him. And instead, let's just go with that. Let's just say Francis won, because I think most people thought he won. That, I think, was a major problem for the UFC, because now we have somebody who was already being called the baddest man on the planet, walked away as an active UFC heavyweight, and then basically became the heavyweight boxing champ. At this point, people were calling Francis Ngannou the greatest combat sports athlete of all time. Now, obviously, he had the fight subsequently against Anthony Joshua, and he got beaten pretty badly, pretty quickly. And that definitely took some of the steam away from Francis, but it still doesn't change the fact that he beat Tyson Fury. And I think that is never going to happen again. That was a one-time thing. I don't even know exactly how it happened, because we definitely did see the skill differential when he fought Anthony Joshua, or at least it looked like a major skill differential. Again, Francis said he was extremely tired and some some other reasons as to why he performed the way he performed. But it doesn't matter. In any event, he essentially beat Tyson Fury, and that is insane. Now what's coming up in the near future with Francis Ngannou? He has got a fight that was just announced in the PFL in the super fight division on October 19th, 2024 against Renan Ferreira. Now, you may not know Renan Ferreira if you're unfamiliar with the PFL or Bellator, but he just won the PFL versus Bellator champion versus champion tournament. He beat Ryan Bader for that belt and that title. And Ryan Bader is a former UFC fighter who had a tremendous amount of success, never was a champion in the UFC, but was a really phenomenal UFC fighter. Now, if people do their research about Renan Ferreira and Ngannou goes out there and starches him in the first round, which it's going to happen one way or another. We're probably going to have a knockout here. It's two big guys going up there with big knockout power, so something crazy is going to happen, and I think most people are probably favoring Francis in this fight. He seems to be, I think, generally considered to be the favorite here. Now, if Francis goes out there and gets a crazy impressive knockout, this is going to cause a lot of waves. This is going to bring a lot of buzz and attention back to Francis, but more importantly, to the PFL. Now, you might say this isn't a big deal. The UFC, why do they care? They're so much bigger and they're so much more powerful and have such a deeper roster than PFL, Bellator, whatever. Why would they care? But if we start to see little cracks in this seemingly impervious sheath of armor, right? If we now say, like, wait a minute, the best fighter in the absolute planet, the baddest man on the planet is not in the UFC anymore, it's in the PFL, that might start getting eyeballs to go to the PFL. That might even start getting some talent to drift over to the PFL as an alternative to the UFC. I think the UFC recognizes, and this is just a theory, and Dana White might say I'm an idiot, and this is totally not the case, but I think with a little bit of momentum, that could potentially put the UFC in a slightly compromised position as you just start to draw away a little bit of their pipeline into having the best fighters and being able to say, hey, the best fighters fight in our organization. This is going to be a big blow to that, especially if he gets a super highlight reel knockout. So again, going back to that previous notion, if Francis wins, people may very well claim that Francis, not Jon Jones, is the pound for pound greatest fighter. Again, I think this is a big problem for the UFC. And why do I think the UFC actually cares about this? Because think about the conversations that Dana White has had repeatedly where he is praising Jon Jones and says, hey, if you put anybody into a room, Jon Jones will always be the man that comes out. Why is he so insistent on this point? Because I think it goes back to Francis beating Tyson Fury. Again, you can never claim that Tyson Fury probably wouldn't walk out of any room with any heavyweight UFC fighter. They would all probably beat him in a no-rules street fight because, again, he only has hands, right? He doesn't have kicks. He doesn't have grappling. He's lacking all these other skills, elbows, knees, whatnot, right? So we can say, if you change the context of the conversation to who walks out of a room, we can immediately dismiss Tyson Fury. And that, again, goes against Francis' legacy, at least in the eyes, potentially, of the public as being the baddest man on the planet. So my point is that Dana White does indeed care about who is denoted as the pound for pound greatest fighter, the baddest man on the planet, just by illustration of that point that he continuously brings up. And again, Francis winning here could shift that conversation. I do think that's a problem potentially for the UFC. As I mentioned before, the PFL could get a huge boost, both in talent and eyeballs. And now here's the wild card. Here's the crazy part. You also have the possibility of eventually adding Jake Paul in an MMA super fight. Now we have Jake Paul. We have Francis hot off a win. We have both of those guys on a card. Who knows? Jake Paul could fight Nate Diaz or somebody else in mixed martial arts. The combination of that could be a massive pay-per-view draw. And I think that not only would that be a one-time boon for that company in terms of pay-per-view buys and profits and all that stuff, but it could start shifting the narrative and the perception in the fans' eyes that, like, PFL is a legitimate organization, and maybe this is something that we should be tuning into. And I think that for whatever, I just, again, think, I don't know this, and this might not even be on the radar of the UFC, and I could be wrong, but I have a feeling that this is why the UFC cares so much about this Jon Jones versus Stipe matchup, because they can see this unfolding potentially. So I believe that they're trying to lay a foundation so that even if Francis wins, it's not going to be considered such a massive deal and won't potentially threaten the business. The other reason why I do think this theory holds some merit is because if you think about the way that the UFC structures its contracts to lock fighters in for multi-fight deals, they don't want to let people out. It's because I think the UFC knows that their bottom line is heavily tied to the roster of fighters, but moreover, the fact that these fighters aren't allowed to fight in other organizations during an active contract. So again, they can maintain that hold on the best fighters on the planet. So if this gets enough tension and starts drawing away maybe rising prospects or other things, I think that could be a problem, and I think the UFC knows it. Now, if we think about casual fans in particular, I think that a lot of them, if we just look at the record of Francis in general compared to Jon Jones, a lot of casuals might see that, hey, wait a minute, Francis does seem a lot more dominant. The reason why is because if we look at his record, with the exception of Ciryl Gane, look at the way he finishes fights. Round 1, right, in 45 seconds. Round 1, 26 seconds. These are all unbelievable knockouts. Stipe was an amazing knockout, just happened to happen in round 2. And Ciryl Gane, he still won, but remember, he had a terrible, terrible knee injury. Remember, he wore braces on both knees, so Ciryl wouldn't know which knee was the problematic knee. His doctors told him not to fight. He was supposed to lose that fight, and he came in and won a decision in 5 rounds, which is even crazier because I think they were probably hoping that he could get a quick knockout so that he didn't have to go the distance with that massive knee injury, but he still went the distance and he still won. But anyways, if you look at this general record and if you compare it to Jones's record with a lot of decisions, a lot of fights going the distance, obviously he beat Ciryl Gane in the first round, but with the exception of that, people might look at those two resumes and be like, oh, Francis was way more dominant. He has this crazy knockout power. Not saying that's what I think, but I could see that being a possible threat again to the organization of the UFC. Now we come to the main point, right? Why Dana White wants Jon Jones versus Stipe for the title. Because if Jones wins, he will be undeniable as the greatest fighter of all time and the baddest man on the planet. And the reason why they'll be able to say that is because right now in the heavyweight division, Francis beat Ciryl, but he beat him in a 5-round decision. Now, obviously there was that massive knee injury, but when we look back, people aren't going to remember that. It's not necessarily written out, right? You'll just look at the record and say 5-round decision versus 1-round finish, okay? So then we look at the fights against Stipe, who is heralded as the greatest heavyweight of all time. He beat Ngannou. Yes, Ngannou beat him the second time, but he beat him. Now Jon Jones goes in and performs as we expect and beats Stipe very easily. Boom. Now 2 guys that, yeah, Francis beat, but Francis lost to one of the guys the first time. Now Jon Jones has come in and dominated both of them. Boom. No question. Debate is over. So there we go. That's my theory on why Dana White is pressing the issue so much on the pound-for-pound discussion with Jon Jones, why he wants the Stipe fight with Jon Jones, and why he wants it for the title. I don't think it has anything to do with Aspinall. I think it's all about Francis Ngannou and the PFL and this potential of Francis Ngannou and the PFL of potentially damaging the brand of the UFC. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. If you agree or disagree, I'd love to hear your thoughts. But again, just remember, whatever the case may be, even if you don't like this fight or feel that Tom Aspinall is being overlooked, even after hearing everything I have to say, I just hope you remember that I just still don't believe this is anything to do with Jon Jones. Not his fault whatsoever. This is a decision made by the UFC brass, in my opinion. If you like this video, make sure to click that like button. If you want to see more from the 10-7 MMA show, make sure to click subscribe. Thank you guys so much for joining, and we'll see you in the next video. Take it easy.